Tell us about AUKUS and the deal there from the British point of view. So Australia's now going to get subs with the help of Britain, plus also the US. So there's a kind of, we're going to get some subs earlier from the US and build them with the UK. What does this mean from the British point of view, and how did the British insert themselves into this process?
Much to the consternation of the French.
As always.
Which is always a little bit of good news when you can annoy the French, because their diesel submarines were decided to be not proper for the 21st century. I think the AUKUS deal is, in Australia, Britain and America, is seriously undervalued. It's enormous. It's probably the biggest defence deal of the 21st century so far. It results in Australia almost quite quickly getting the Virginia-class submarines from America, the nuclear-powered but not nuclear-armed, submarines ideally suited for an ocean the size of the Pacific, which is far, far bigger than the Atlantic, and then working with Britain to build the successor to Britain's Astute-class submarines, which are already world beaters, and the new ones will be even more world beaters. It also means an intermingling of our three countries. Australian crews will train on American and British boats, and then American and British crews will come and work on Australian boats as well. It really brings the country lot together, and it's a lot more than submarines. It is a recognition that Britain, Australia, America, other allies in the Pacific region, from Japan to South Korea and so on, need to stand together, need to counter the rise of China. And so it also involves massive investment in artificial intelligence, in robotics, and in digital technology, all to power the economies of the future. And I think it's a huge, and I'm delighted that Britain, which is a long way from the Pacific, yes, and not a superpower, is nevertheless going to play a major part. And that was enhanced by the fact that Britain is now joining the Pacific Free Trade Organization as well. I hope America comes into it too. And alone among European powers, Britain will play a role, not a massive role, but will play a role in the future of the Pacific with other democracies in a way that the Germans or the French or the Italians will not.
Rita.
I want to ask you about the political landscape in the UK. You mentioned Labor ahead in the polls. We saw Boris win in a landslide, and then
throw it away.
Throw it away in so many ways, but his green... He seemed to be captured by the Green movement in a way that surprised many. And what's happening in the energy sector in the UK, the number of people who are now effectively in energy poverty, tell us about that, because we seem to be following in your footsteps.
Well, the cost of energy, of household fuel bills, gas and electricity, was enormous because Britain depends hugely on gas. We didn't issue new licenses for gas fields in the North Sea, so we have to import it. Of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the price of gas went through the roof. It spiked in August of last year. It's coming down now, and that will be reflected in fuel bills to come. But it was eye-watering. The average family faced a fuel bill of around almost 5,000 Australian dollars a year. I mean, it's huge for the average. And, unlike, you can put off buying a car, you can say, that fridge will do for a while. But the two things you cannot do without are fuel and food. And these were the two things that really spiked. So the government had to intervene massively in subsidizing fuel bills, gave a price guarantee that they wouldn't go above $5,000. That was still pretty high for a lot of ordinary families, when putting food on the table was also difficult. So it's cost, on top of the cost of the pandemic, the cost of dealing with these fuel bills has been huge as well. As I say, that's beginning to soften. But what it's done is that although the politicians still talk the talk about net zero, they're not really walking the walk now, because they've seen the price that it costs. And in Britain, and I think it's true in this country too, you have the concerns of what I would call a bourgeois elite, or even a haute bourgeois, an upper middle class elite, who take decisions which they think are the right decisions for the future of the country, but they don't pay the price because they can afford the fuel bills. And I think too often ordinary families are paying the price for a particular ideology and a view, interestingly on the left as well, that they take this, that doesn't take into account the inability of the ordinary family to be able to meet the bills.
James.
So we had Professor Ian Plimer on a little while ago, and he talked about how when you've got a consensus between both parties on something, you get bad policy. And is it going to take this whole energy crisis to finally break what we see here in Australia, which is where both sides accept net zero as a worthwhile goal, just, about the terms and how long you want to take to get there?
Well, as I look in from the outside with your energy policy, I think you're heading for some real trouble. I mean, I think you could be heading for brownouts and maybe even blackouts if you.
Well, that's what our regulators say.
But that's decisions that politicians will take these decisions and then have to go with the consequences of it. It is true that when there's a consensus that isn't even questioned, you do get bad policy. I think there is now more questioning going on. Not that people are becoming climate change deniers, but I think they're skeptical of some of the solutions. And when you do get politicians all saying the same thing, that's the time when journalists should be most on edge, should be most questioning. My problem is that most environmental journalists are basically activists with laptops. That I've often said to some, I don't understand why some media outlets pay why they pay these journalists. I mean, Greenpeace should pay this. And I think we just need to be a little bit more questioning of some of the things. Keep in mind that it's ordinary people, as my old mentor at The Economist used to call them, plain folk, which he meant in the nicest way, plain folk, the backbone of all our countries. They often meet the costs of stupid decisions by politicians. And I'm also very wary of politicians who set targets for years so far in the future that they'll be long gone.
Yes.
It's easy to set a target by 2050. There's not a single person I would vouch in either the British, the American, or the Australian cabinet who'll be in power by 2050. They'll be long gone. And I would much rather they set targets for a period in which we, the voters, can hold them accountable. You didn't make that. You made that, well done. You didn't make that. You were wrong to have that target, weren't you? That's holding them to account. 2050, I mean, even I might not be around by 2050. I intend to be, but I probably won't be.
I'm sure you will be, Andrew. I'm sure you will be. Just very, very quickly, if you were to have Anthony Albanese, what would be the question for him?
Why are so many questions about this massive constitutional change, the voice? Why did they remain unanswered? How can Australians take an informed decision when they don't know the answer to simple questions like who will choose the voice, what will its powers be, how much will it cost? Until you get answers to that, I don't know how you can take a decision.
Fantastic. That was, of course, Britain's greatest television interviewer, Andrew Neil.